So anyone here ever have an issue getting a building through a building code? Anyone? Guys up front have, okay. Yeah, so that's me. Yep, like I said, I'm registered in 2/3 of the states, a couple of provinces in Canada. I've been working at VAA for 15 years. A couple things we're gonna go through. We have a lot today, but I'm gonna get you out of here on time. No one wants to sit in extra hours and miss the happy hours. The app, if you download the app, you can download this presentation, so you don't have to take pictures, you can, or take notes. The majority of this is to get you aware of some of the smaller sections of the code that apply to the grain industry. The other thing we're going to look at today is a couple of high points. There's no such thing as a loophole in the code. If it's in the code, it's part of the code. And if you know it's there, you can use it, right? So you might as well know as much about the code as you can to use it for your advantage. Don't ever mistake the code for common sense. A lot of the stuff doesn't make sense until you really look into it. And also, we don't have time to look at every example. Maybe we can talk later, but if you're looking at an MCC next to a boot pit, and that boot pit has to be underground, and you want to put a second level on it, and it's in Canada, yeah, we've looked at that, but not everybody wants to sit through that. So, the IBC is under the umbrella of the ICC, International Code Council. So the ICC has the IFC, the mechanical, the electrical, the gas, plumbing, all those. Back in the day, before 2000, we had this lovely map. We had the UBC, the SBC, the BOCA. Anyone here from Wisconsin? You're from Wisconsin? You, if no one's told you today, are special. You had your own code. In addition to that, Chicago, New York, LA, I think Kansas City, all had their own codes. In 2000, the IBC came about, right? It's on a 3-year cycle, so 2003, 6, 9, 12, you get the idea. Our latest one is 2024. And as of 2023, California adopted it. California first went with the NFPA 5000, which was another code, but they got in line. So pretty much every state has some version of the IBC. Even Arkansas, where it says there's no code, it does have a code, but it's brought in through the fire code. There are a few states which have choose your own adventure. One of our favorite states of Illinois, let's see, we have East Peoria is the 2006, Rockford's 2021. Missouri is also choose your own adventure, but they've pretty much all adopted the criteria of the 2018. So if you've ever been in St. Louis and taken the bridge to East St. Louis and thought, wow, these are two totally different areas, well, they are code-wise because you're going from 18 to 2006. For reference, in all these criteria, I'm going to be using the 2018. Why the 2018? It's used quite a bit. The 2024 is used in Ohio. It's just getting adopted. So 2018 is pretty much the standard as of now, and it'll continue to phase out. So depending on your state, you also have to figure out, well, who has jurisdiction? Is it the city? Is it the county? Is the county so small or the city so small that they farm out to a third-party code group? Anybody here from, Wisconsin? You know, what about Wisconsin and your code process? Every building that you submit in Wisconsin goes to the state for review. It's just the process. To one-up them, Indiana, every building you submit for code review goes through the Department of Homeland Security. I don't know why. But they do a pretty good job, both of them being state agencies. They have good response times. They're professional. They do a good job. South Dakota adopts the 2021 IBC, but they have a clause that says any municipality can change that in any way. So although you might be looking at a facility in Sioux Falls, in Aberdeen, it might be totally different. Still 2021. In Nebraska had a very strong fire marshal, and he produced a lot of interpretations that affected the code. Grain tunnels in Nebraska were required to be sprinklered, which you find out the hard way once. And then I took that piece of paper and I put it on our wall. And at VAA, we had a flood, and that piece of paper was washed away. We had a sprinkler line break. The next project in Nebraska, I said, I got to find that piece of paper. I went on the state website. I couldn't find it. I called the state fire marshal, and they said, well, yeah, about that. Some of these interpretations were ruled that they can't be enforced because they changed the code without going through the proper channels. So currently, you don't need to sprinkler a tunnel in Nebraska. It might come back, but those are little nuances that, yeah, you have issues with that once. So jurisdiction, one of my favorite projects. We had a jurisdiction in a county number 1, in the city. A little tiny part of that was in county number 2. Across the river was county number 3. It's a navigable waterway, so the Army Corps of Engineers is involved. And if we did anything and impact any of that, across the river was the DNR. Luckily for us, the city took over. But that's the kind of complications you can get at or get into. That particular city and that particular site, when I went to that site, I asked them, do you have any issues with the fire, the AHJ, the authority having jurisdiction? And they pointed to an encased fire helmet in the corner of their conference room. They said, no, we were given this as an award for having worked with the fire department so well. In fact, they use our stairs to train because it's one of the higher things in the county. I love that, right? When you go and ask someone, hey, what's your relationship with your fire marshal? And they start cursing, you know you're going into a situation that might be a little more difficult. So now we know who has jurisdiction. We know what year we're going to use. What occupancy is it? So occupancies, Bs are business. Usually there's some form of B in an office or in a grain facility, where it's a control room. You don't have to rate it as a B. It can be a B accessory if it's a small enough area. Fs are F1 is a factory. So if you're processing grain, if you're doing something to that grain, it's food processing. It's an F1. If you're not processing, if you're storing, or I'm sorry, F2 we don't get into as much in the grain industry. Those are things that do not burn. Okay, beverages, bricks, beverages below a certain alcohol percentage. S occupancy. So if you're storing grain, it's an S1. Low hazard storage is fertilizer. One of my favorites, if you're going to store a warehouse full of ivory, it's in the code, it's an S2. When things get into the code, they don't get out of the code. So if you're going to store a warehouse full of fur, that's an S1. H's. So there's a whole list of H's, but what we focus on is an H2. It's a deflagration hazard. So the difference between deflagration and explosion. Explosion, the shock wave is faster than the sound, speed of sound. You hear the boom. Deflagration, shock wave is not faster than speed of sound. Still has major issues. So for all of your H's, you determine if it's an H based on the quantity of the hazard. If you're storing tanks of gasoline, you go to table 307 and you look at it. For combustible dust, we go to quantities that say C note Q. Oh, okay. You go to C note Q, they say C414.1.3. You go to 414.1.3, that's where it says that you have to have a report done by a qualified person. That qualified person needs to be approved by the building official. It doesn't have to be in DHA, it can be a report, but typically that's the only reference in the building code to a DHA or to a risk assessment. And it aligns well with the verbiage in 660. There are some other areas that relate specific to grain elevators, and they're not in a good location. They're in chapter 426. So 426 says that if you have a type 1 or type 2 building that is for similar use to a grain elevator, you can have unlimited height and area. Okay? Grinding rooms. If you have operations that produce combustible dust, you're an H2. We'll come back to that one. The other occupancies, we're sitting here today in an A. We have education, I's, M's, R's, U's, utility. If you have a grain bin or silo or tower that's associated with a residential area, so a non-commercial, a family farm, it's a U. If it's associated with anything other than residential, silos are an S1. So, how big can it be? So you go to this table. So this table gives you height in stories, and there's another table, height in feet. You need to know what your occupancy is. So we've gone through occupancies. You need to know if it's sprinklered or non-sprinklered, because you have different allowable heights in both height and in story height, so feet and or stories. And you don't need to know the type of construction. So that's the next one. Type of construction. 1s and 2s, those are non-combustible. Type 3 is non-combustible exterior walls, but you can have anything interior. Type 4 is a heavy timber. And type 5 is basically wood, it can be anything. So I've seen some heavy timber in older areas. The difference between a type 1 and type 2, take this home and you can read it, right? So there's a specific table of 601 and 602. We're not going to get into it. We're just, yeah, it's based on the distance away from your property line or other buildings in which you have to rate to different criteria. So for a general building, you can go to table 506.2, say we're an F1, and we're SM means sprinklered multi-story, so we're like a 3-story building. And we're type 2B, we can have 46,500 square feet. The number's not that important, but here's the exercise. There are another section of code that says that special industrial use, if you claim that it's a special industrial use, it could be exempt from all those tables, right? Building height and building area can be exempt if you're a special industrial use. So special industrial use is a type of process or manufacturing that needs height or area to do what you do. They typically call out steel mills, right? We have argued special industrial occupancy for height for grain elevators because you need height for a grain elevator. Now you can have a small grain elevator, so it doesn't work as well for area, but definitely for height. Special industrial occupancy is a great use, so you can be as high as you want. Mezzanines and equipment platforms. A floor is a floor, but what you call that floor matters, right? A mezzanine is an area that can be up to 2/3 the size of the room that it's in, okay? It doesn't contribute to your number of stories, and it doesn't contribute to your egress. An equipment platform is also an area that is open to your main room that is 2/3 of the size, but it doesn't add to your area or your fire area. So fire area is the amount of room the fire can go before it hits an exterior wall or a fire barrier. And then we have unlimited. So if you're an F2 or an S2 and you have 60 feet around, you can be unlimited. But we usually don't get into those in grain. If you have a single or two-story FBSM, so a business or factory or storage, and you're sprinklered, you can be unlimited. So how big can it be? We have an F1, it's 3 stories. Our table says we can have 46,500, but we're at 60,000. So the other aspect to this is you can go to a frontage increase. So the amount of area that you have open around your building is your frontage. So if your area is open all the way around your building, you have 100% frontage open. This calculation is a little confusing, so now in 2024 they put it in a table. But basically, you take 25% of your open area and throw it away. That's tax, right? You don't get 100% increase. But if you're open all the way around your building by 30 feet, you get 75% increase. So with a 75% increase, then you're up around 87,000 square feet per floor. But wait, there's more. That's all through the table. So you get one number from the table, then you can increase it through frontage. If you go back to this, grain elevators, you have unlimited area, unlimited height. Okay? So if you're using 426.11, you're unlimited. So why do we go through all 3 of those? If you can make your building fit in that table, make your building fit in the table. If it fits at 47,000 or 46,500, call it an F1, and the code official is going to say, yep, I know that table, yep, I know that, and he's going to move on. If you can't make that fit, or you need a height exemption, use special industrial occupancy, because that's an easy one. If you can't make either one of them fit, then you pull out this. This is not as typical for a standard code official. It works, but take the easiest path to making them say yes, right? So, what else do I need? Yeah, sprinklers. So, remember I said that if you have an equipment platform, it doesn't contribute to your fire area. And that's good, because this is where fire area comes in. F1s, S1s are compatible, and they have the same pretty much fire area criteria. If you have a fire area that exceeds 12,000 square feet, you need a sprinkler. If all of your fire areas added up are 24,000 square feet, you need a sprinkler. If your fire area is more than 3 stories above ground, you need a sprinkler. And another one that comes up a little bit, if you have a commercial garage that's 5,000 square feet, you need a sprinkler. So if you decide that you want to have a parking garage that's 50 by 100 and store vehicles there, make it 49 by 100, so you're not at 5,000. So these are the rules, okay? H requirements, if it's an H, like a grinding room, automatic, needs to be sprinklered. Underground structures, and this is where you have to read, for human occupancy. I don't know any grain structure that's for human occupancy, right? But officials will bring this up and say, oh, you have an underground structure. Well, no, because it's not for human occupancy. So watch out for that one. High pile storage, so if you have racking that's over a certain height, 12 feet, you need a sprinkler. And stories without openings. This is one that's in the code. It's not enforced as much, right? They would say that if you have a flat storage building and you don't have openings every 50 feet, you should sprinkler it. And yet we don't, right? There are specific areas that could be incidental use in your facilities. If you have a boiler room over a certain criteria, you're required a sprinkler or provide a 1-hour barrier. Stationary battery storage, that's become a big one. Most of that is based on battery backup criteria, and it's based on the type of battery and how big of a battery system you have. My favorite, just to throw in there, B occupancy, your standard business, no requirement for sprinkling, none. So why do we sprinkler some of these things and not sprinkle others? A couple reasons. Who's your insurer? Insurance plays a big deal in sprinkling or non-sprinkling. Another aspect, what's your owner culture, right? We've been asked to do some certain criteria that are above and beyond the code by owners because that's their criteria. So let's say you have an S1 and you want to do it 20,000 square feet. But you can't have one fire area that's over 12,000 square feet. One simple aspect is just to cut it in half with a fire barrier. Okay? What's a fire barrier? Fire barriers, fire partitions, and fire walls all get confused because the wording is off. A fire partition is a corridor area, and it stops the rate of fire. A fire barrier is what probably everyone here would consider a fire wall, right? That's around a shaft, a stair, incidental use areas, horizontal exits. And a fire wall is what a lot of people would consider a party wall that divides a building into two different buildings. So if you can't make the area, or if you're going up against an existing building that's non-code compliant, you put up a fire wall and say, we're starting new over here, right? With that firewall, it has to remain standing whether either side falls down, and it's typically a 3-hour. So it's not a inexpensive investment, but it does give you an area to say, starting forward on this side, we're compliant, even if some of the stuff over here isn't compliant. What it also gives you is an exit. Because if you're on one side and you go through a 3-hour firewall to a different building, in theory, you can hang out there for 2.5 hours because you're in a different building and you're separated from 3-hour, right? Fire-rated shafts. So if you have a fire-rated shaft that is more than 4 stories, it's a 2-hour. If you have it 3 stories or less, right, connecting 4 stories or more, 2-hour. 3 stories or less, 1 hour. But remember, mezzanines and equipment platforms are not stories. So if you're connecting 1 floor and a mezzanine and another floor and an equipment platform, it's only 2 stories. It's not 4. And fire protection for those shafts, you need to protect your shaft from the hazard. The hazard, 99% of the time, is from the building. Get into some ethanol facilities, there could be a hazard from outside the building with tanks and storage. But typically, you're protecting that fire, or that shaft, from the interior of the building. So in the upper right, you only need to fire rate those 2 walls. The lower left, on an exterior stair, you just need to fire rate the wall between the stair, and you need to go 10 feet beyond so that the fire doesn't lap around. How many exits? So there's a lot of criteria. We're not going to get too deep into how many exits, but it's based on the number of people you have and the size of the exit and whether it's sprinklered or not. It's also based on common path of travel. Common path of travel is a concept for how far you can go before you go right or left. Travel distance is how far you can go before you go outside or into a rated corridor. It's also based on stories, because the IBC usually has 2 tables for everything. If you're 3 stories, you need a second exit. But there again, if it's not a story and it's a mezzanine is not a story, you may be able to have 1 exit. So here's the concept of a common path of travel, how far you can go before you can go right or left. Everyone here can stand up and either go right or left. So your common path of travel is 0. My common path of travel is I have to get off the stage before I can get to that point, then I can go right or left. Code doesn't allow you to jump. Travel distance is how far you go from your most remote point to either the outside or to a fire barrier. You get more area or more travel distance if you sprinkler. You'll have more time to run, right? You get 200 feet if you're non-sprinklered. You get 250 feet if you're sprinklered. And that's just for an F1. If you look at an H, they say that your non-sprinklered distance is not permitted because you have to sprinkler an H. They don't even give you an option for non-sprinklered. It's because all H's are required to be sprinklered. We're over halfway there. So now we know the rules. How do we interpret some of those rules for grain facilities? So grinding rooms. Grinding rooms that produce combustible dust are an H, an H2. Sprinklers are required. Egress are required if you have 3 occupants in there based on the size of the room. You need 2 exits. Okay? And your common path of travel is only 25 feet. So it's really stringent. So typically, we look at grinding rooms and we try to conform to most of the standard criteria. Call it an H. Provide your egress, right? You want a safe way out of your grinding room. When we look at sprinklering, the requirement for an H2, what's the hazard in a grinding room? It's typically not fire. It's a deflagration. The deflagration is in the equipment. If you have a deflagration in your equipment and you have a sprinkler system, a millisecond later you just have a water feature, right? The water will never stop a deflagration. So you can argue, and we have successfully, to say the best way to stop a deflagration is with a pressurized canister system, or proper venting, or a flame arrestor. You address the specific concern. Now, if you're on the DHA seminar this morning, they pointed out that there's some risk assessment there, right? Because not all the canister systems put out fires. There may be residual fire, but they are there to address the deflagration. But that is the main concern. If you have proper exiting, if you have 2 exits out of your hammer mill, and you're stopping the deflagration event, the secondary fire, because you're going to have equipment issues anyway, is probably not the critical event there. So we've been able to get through a lot of criteria with code officials by using fire suppression canisters. And of course, all the other safeguards, right? So you have the metal, you have the magnets, so you don't have tramp metal. You have airlocks. You have all the other criteria that's known in the industry to reduce hazard. That's part of the risk assessment. Any comments or questions on the hammer mills? Yep. I do not consider a roller mill a hammer mill because you're not grinding, you're rolling. Yeah, there's less potential for spark. Yep. Yeah, and the little finger mill, obviously I'm not a equipment specialist. But yeah, we have gone through those, and yeah, is grinding just particle reduction? Is grinding specific to a hammer mill? They're saying anything that produces combustible dust. But typically, if it's a roller mill, we don't consider that as a critical mass of combustible dust. That's how we've addressed it. Yes? Yep. It does not. It does not, because it didn't matter if you were sprinklered or not. You have to be sprinklered, so there isn't a lower option on the table. They've taken that one away. So we always try to give proper egress. I mean, and well, one thing I should have mentioned up front, code is a minimum, right? It's a minimum standard. So let's say, well, we're meeting the code, you're meeting the bare minimum standard. When you say it like that, it's not as impressive. But you want to make sure that you have proper egress. So don't put your hammer mill on the 5th floor. And if, you know, or if you do, then you're going to have some rated stair towers because you have to get to an area pretty quick. Don't put an office, in a true office, on the 5th floor, because now you have occupants way up high. Okay. What else do we counter? Oh yeah. Sprinkling in general. So someone says you need a sprinkler. Well, what if you don't have water? Now you're talking a storage tank, a pump, a fire pump, sprinkler system. We use sprinklers to increase height, to increase area, common path of travel, you get longer travel distances, and we can use sprinkling to reduce some wall ratings, right? Unfortunately, the building code is not concerned about your commodity. They don't care if your grain gets wet, right? Now, what we typically do is we say, hey, if our grain does get wet, here's what happens. If you sprinkler, we've had people say, hey, you should sprinkler your bins because that's over the fire area. And we're like, that's a horrible idea. You wet the grain. One, if you have a hopper bottom, it's designed for grain, not for water, right? So now you have added structural loads. Now you have wet grain that's going to swell. Water trying to get to, and part of this is also in flat storage. Same issue. You have wet grain. Water is not an effective extinguishing method on most grain fires, right? There is criteria, you discuss that with the AHJ, flat storage. if you're doing it the way we'd like to see it, it's a non-occupied space, right? You fill it up, it's full of grain. Life safety in the building code is to preserve life, right? Fire safety, the fire code is to get people out of the building, but also be able to come in and protect the firefighters when you're coming in. This is when you talk to not your building official, you talk to your fire official. Mr. First Responder, fire chief, volunteer fire captain, whoever is responding to your fire, how are you going to fight this fire? Have that discussion with them so they don't just show up and start blasting water through every opening they can have, right? Have that discussion before, have they read the NFGA firefighting criteria for grain facilities? It's an excellent resource. They recommend that you don't do a stream on grain piles because with capillary action, a lot of the water sheds off anyway. You're not going to get your water source to the hot spot. There's, as I discussed, the criteria for buildings with openings. We proposed one flat storage with little X marks the spot where you could knock out a wall panel. We discussed that with our fire officials, and they said, we show up with axes. We don't need an X marks the spot. We will make a spot where we need. That makes sense, right? If you understand how they're going to fight the fire and have a discussion with them, a lot of the fire-related aspects of the building code can be addressed without sprinklering. Any questions on that? Tunnels. Like I said, in Nebraska, we used to have to sprinkler tunnels. Tunnels are not basements. Basement's a word that signifies that someone may be down there. And there's maybe somebody down there. But tunnels, if you explain a grain tunnel to a building official like a steam tunnel, oh, okay, sometimes they get it. And I mentioned earlier, depending on where you're at, some jurisdictions have seen a lot of grain projects, right? They understand this, everything we're talking about. Some jurisdictions have not seen a grain project, and they're going to Google issues with grain facilities, and then they're going to go, wow, these things are really dangerous. You want to step in and have that conversation early and walk them through the criteria, right? We argue that they're similar to steam tunnels. Your egress from a tunnel is typically governed by OSHA, not IBC, because it's usually not an occupiable space. So we usually have an OSHA stair on one end and a ladder exit on the other, so you have two ways out. You want to make sure that you have good clearance around your tail and your head, so you're not trapped on one side or the other. Also, one of my favorite lines from OSHA for egress, and I'll summarize, one exit works if one exit works. Basically, they're saying if you can prove that one exit works, you can use one exit. There's no teeth there, right? There's nothing to measure against. They also say, if you want to use NFPA 101, you can use that. That's where we bring in Chapter 40 out of NFPA 101. It's a fire life safety code. Chapter 40 is for special industrial occupancies. And Chapter 40 will give you distances for sprinkler to non-sprinklered special industrial occupancies. It's something measurable. It's something to say we've designed to NFPA 101. So what does NFPA 101 say? NFPA 101 says egress distance 300 feet for non-sprinklered. So that's what we use out of a tunnel, which means you could have a 599 foot long tunnel. Well, Actually, no, because you have to count the egress up. You could have a 580-foot tunnel, and from the center, you can go and get out 300 feet each way. And we also use that for catwalks. The concern with catwalks is they're not governed by the IBC. We go with OSHA. The hazard for a catwalk is usually not like the cartoons where it's following you, right? It's usually an isolated event. And if you can go 300 feet that way, you've gotten a safe distance away. So if you're a safe distance away, can you go another 300 feet? We've had some unique situations where we're crossing ground that you can't go down to. Swampy ground, you're covering a levee, you're going over a highway. There's no place where you can go down. So those distances get in that 900-foot range. But if you're in the middle, you can get a safe distance away by going the other way from that event. It's not like a burning building where, if you're in a burning building, once you get outside and you're away from that event, you're okay. So we've used that concept for catwalks and tunnels. Automatic smoke hatches, absolutely required for anything over 50,000 square feet. We've never put them in. If you talk to a fire official, we're going to put in automatic smoke hatches so you can fight the fire from above. And they say, well, I'm not sending anybody on top of a flat storage building. I'm not going to fight it from up there. Okay, we're going to put in fire or automatic smoke hatches per code so it gets rid of all the smoke. And they said, well, yeah, but as you're getting rid of all that smoke, now you're creating a chimney effect, and my fire gets worse, right? So this is one we draw them in so that there's a line item for them in the building criteria. We have that discussion with the fire official, and we've never put one in. And then we can go back and say, hey, we just saved you $120,000 by not putting in smoke hatches. Any questions on smoke hatches? Existing conditions. There may or may not be a mill out there that may not be quite up to the current code. How do you deal with an expansion to an existing facility that was built in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 80s that doesn't meet the IBC? So a building is required to meet the code of when it was built, right? So if you meet the UBC or the SBC or the BOCA when that was built, and you're not doing major renovations to it, it's okay. But as soon as you build next to it, you have concerns about going back and forth, proximity to buildings. So as I mentioned before, that's when you build a fire wall, a 3-hour wall in between. You have that separation. You can say that this is an existing condition, and from on this side, we're meeting the current conditions. What do you do with remodels? You're going to go through your existing facility and retool it. You're going to do a different type of wheat. You're going to do a newer process. We usually argue that newer processes with newer technology, somewhat smaller, safer, because you have all the criteria. You have all your plug sensors, all your bearing sensors, all your heat sensors, all the criteria in a modern facility. It's safer. Is it meet code? We can get it there. That's also a discussion you need to have with the owner's rep, and the insurance company. There is an international existing buildings code, and existing grain facilities fit even worse into that code than they do the IBC. It's a really difficult checklist to go through, and there's about 19 different criteria, and you have to pass so many. I'm not saying it's not an option, but it's a difficult option to go down. So key takeaways. One, no such thing as loophole. If you know the code, it's going to help you out. And this was a really fast presentation. There's a lot more nuances in there, but these are the key things I think are going to help the grain industry. The IBC is throughout the U.S. Some jurisdictions may have those unique amendments to the IBC. So be really specific when you're talking to your AHJ, figuring out who has jurisdiction. Make it easy for the code official to say yes. Make a standard document that goes through and says, this is what it is and this is how we're navigating the code. Because if they can follow the bouncing ball through the code, it brings up less questions. We're not trying to hide anything from the building official. We're not trying to whitewash any hazards or issues. But if you step them through the code and say, this is how we're presenting this, it's a much smoother process. Sprinklering is not going away, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how your take on sprinklering is. Every year it gets more and more stringent on buildings you can do without sprinklering. Currently, we've been through a lot of criteria for bins and flat storage, and say you have a building that has a first floor, and then a mezzanine, and then a second floor, and an equipment platform, and then another floor, and then another equipment platform. It's only 3 stories, right? And if you have that same scenario, but you had first floor, equipment platform, second floor, equipment platform, third floor, and you call it a mezzanine, now you have a fire area above your third floor. So what you call things matters. H occupancies, if it's an H, requires sprinklering, but your main goal is to address the hazard in the room, right? So through fire canisters, fire suppression, or through deflagration suppression systems, we've been able to not sprinkler H's. And if in doubt, reach out. I like to talk with people early, because if you're talking to me late in a project, something's gone wrong, right? You've already had an issue with code official. They're calling up and say, why isn't this an H? If you lead them through the criteria early, it's really beneficial. We have had a panel of people present to a fire official. 2 of them were on the sounding board for an FPA 61. I went through the same presentation. They said, wow, that was a great presentation. Really like the people that you put together. It's an excellent panel of people that really know everything that we're about NFPA 61. We're like, okay, all right, great. Yeah, you still need to sprinkle your building. We've taken the same group of people to a different jurisdiction, and they're like, that makes sense. Yeah, you don't have to sprinkle your building. There's no one magic bullet that solves it all. You're always going to find 1 or 2, maybe code officials that dig their heels in. Try to meet them halfway. And always have the owner's rep and the insurance company involved in those discussions. Because if your insurance company has criteria where you must do something, that raises the level. If you have an insurance company that says, I will sign off on this as a non-sprinkler building, that can have sway with a fire official. Any questions? Here are some links. And that's me.
All right, guys.
Too late. Too late, we're going to the bar.
Yeah.
Excellent question. An MCC does not require a fire barrier unless if you, and here's why, let me repeat. MCCs are typically have a fire barrier around them because if you have a sprinkler building and you have an MCC and you don't want to sprinkler it, you put a 2-hour fire barrier around it, right? If you have a non-sprinkler building and you have an MCC room that doesn't need to be sprinklered, typically you don't need to put a fire barrier around it. There's also a criteria with electrical equipment and wet transformers. So an acid-filled transformer of a certain size has to have a fire barrier. So on the electrical code side, if your equipment is of a certain type, you need to rate it because of that equipment. But your standard MCC room doesn't require a fire barrier unless it's in a sprinkler building, you don't want to sprinkler it. Make sense?
Yep, that's how I
Yep. Anybody else? I have cards up here, but you can download the app, or download the app and download the presentation and take it home and read that and put you to bed. Thank you.
Thank you, Travis. Everybody give Travis a hand. Great presentation. We appreciate it.